Amidst the political events unfolding in the region, one of the most pressing questions that comes to mind as we follow these developments is, why does America do this? Why do they support Israel so blindly? The Western media constantly promotes the idea that the reason for this support lies in shared values: democracy, human rights, and the like. However, if we look behind the curtain and peer into the locked drawers, we find that the story is entirely different from what is being told. Behind what is happening lies a political pressure machine that was established even before Israel itself was founded, a machine capable of breaking presidential decisions, shifting policies, and directing billions of dollars to strike our region, allowing the occupation to transform America, the superpower, into a circus or a puppet theater that it controls. But before we dive in, if you're new to the channel, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe. On May 12, 1948, just 2 days before the declaration of the State of Israel, a meeting took place in the Oval Office that would change the face of the Middle East forever. Would America recognize this new Jewish state or not? The meeting was a clash between two factions within the American administration. The first was represented by General George Marshall, the U.S. Secretary of State at the time, supported by nearly all leaders of the State Department and the military. They rejected the idea of recognizing the establishment of Israel, believing that siding with it would create eternal enmity with the Arab world and damage American interests in the region. On the other hand, there was the faction represented by Clark Clifford, the White House Special Counsel for Domestic Policy. For Clifford, the priority was what was happening on American soils, specifically Jewish votes and their campaign donations, which Truman desperately needed for the upcoming 1948 elections. This pressure did not emerge from a vacuum. The Israeli lobby, known today as AIPAC, which, God willing, we will dedicate a separate episode to, already had a presence at the heart of the American system 6 years before the recognition of the alleged state. Specifically, in May 1942, a meeting was held at the Biltmore Hotel in New York, attended by 586 American Zionist leaders. In this meeting, they established the American Zionist Emergency Council, whose role from the very first moment was to mobilize support, influence officials, stifle any dissenting voices, and elevate Jewish interests above any other voice in America. Ultimately, this faction triumphed, and Truman recognized Israel. Subsequently, with Dwight Eisenhower's arrival at the presidency, the situation shifted slightly. Eisenhower was a former general and was not as easily pressured politically as Truman had been. At the same time, he believed that America's interests in the Middle East were threatened by its bias toward Israel. Perhaps what best summarizes his perspective is document NSC 5411/1 referenced as NE 73, in which he literally stated that the United States' association with Israel is a source of constant irritation in American-Arab relations and the primary obstacle to American influence in the Middle East. In 1955, when the occupation attacked Gaza in the operation known as Black Arrow, in which approximately 38 or 39 Egyptian soldiers were martyred, Gamal Abdel Nasser turned to the Soviet Union to conclude the Soviet-Czech arms deal. Following this, in 1956, he nationalized the Suez Canal, at which point Israel seized the opportunity and joined England and France in the tripartite aggression. In early 1957, Eisenhower threatened to cut government aid and revoke the tax-exempt status of private donations collected for them in America unless they withdrew graciously. This was one of the rare instances where an American president stood against the Zionist occupation to protect American interests. In fact, the deep state apparatus itself was struggling with the Zionist lobby. For example, in 1951, Allen Dulles, then the deputy director of plans for the CIA, oversaw a secret operation to fund and organize a counter-lobby to the Zionist lobby under the name American Friends of the Middle East. Because American law prohibits the CIA from funding any activities within the United States, this operation was a direct violation of the law, which illustrates the extent to which state agencies in America were desperately trying to simply balance the scales. Of course, American support for Israel was not purely political. Rather, it is rooted in the doctrine of a large segment of the American people. The lobby played on the chord of Christian Zionism, the ideas of which began as early as 1585 with the English clergyman Thomas Brightman, who is historically considered the spiritual father of the concept of Christian Zionism. In 1585, Brightman wrote clearly in his famous Commentary on the Book of Revelation about the necessity of the Jews' return to Palestine as a theological condition to accelerate the events and the return of Christ. These ideas naturally reached America with the early settlers who founded it. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Sunday schools played a pivotal role in instilling these ideas into the minds of millions of Christians in America, making their acceptance of the Zionist project a religious duty rather than mere sympathy. Furthermore, the American Zionist Emergency Council, which we mentioned, established a formidable infrastructure in America. They founded more than 400 branches in every state across the country. Through these branches, they pressured every member of Congress, sending delegations, organizing seminars in churches, and directing thousands of letters to politicians. They adopted a strategy of flooding the offices of Congress and the White House with hundreds of thousands of letters and telegrams to create a state of momentum and public consensus behind any demand they made. This propaganda reached its peak in 1958 with the novel Exodus, which remained on the bestseller list for many months. Just 2 years later, specifically in 1960, it was adapted into a motion picture of which David Ben-Gurion himself said, "Exodus is the greatest piece of propaganda ever written about Israel." The film portrayed the Arab as a savage and the Zionist settler as a hero, making the Desert Blue Man image that became firmly imprinted in the mind of the American citizen when it was John F. Kennedy's turn to enter the White House. He sought to resolve the refugee crisis and prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons in the Middle East. In an attempt to approach Israel in August 1962, he broke the arms embargo that the Eisenhower administration had imposed and agreed to sell MIM-3 Hawk anti-aircraft missiles. His goal was to pressure Israel into accepting the Johnson Plan for the return of Palestinian refugees to their land, as well as allowing inspections of the Dimona reactor. This marked the first time America had sold such advanced weaponry directly to Israel. However, the Israelis naturally took the weapons and refused to offer any concessions in return. Ben-Gurion fiercely rejected the proposal at the time, declaring that Israel would not accept the return of refugees, not even a single one. Regarding the nuclear file, when Golda Meir, was foreign minister at the time, met Kennedy on December 27, 1962, she lied to him, assuring him that the Dimona reactor was for peaceful purposes only. At the same time she was making these claims, an organized theft of highly enriched uranium was taking place on American soil. Official reports later released by the U.S. Department of Energy in 2001 confirmed that 269 kilograms of highly enriched uranium had disappeared from the NUMEC plant in Apollo, Pennsylvania. Since a single fission bomb requires between 15 to 25 kilograms, the stolen quantity was sufficient to manufacture between 11 and 18 nuclear bombs. In February 1976, Carl Duke, the CIA's deputy director for science and technology, provided a briefing to the leadership of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, stating that the stolen uranium had been smuggled out and used in the first bombs Israel manufactured. Thus, instead of America punishing them, it covered for them. The Israeli nuclear program continued its path in complete tranquility, with a total blackout on the file, and Israel obtained exactly what it wanted from America, whether by consent or by force. After Kennedy's assassination, which a broad segment of people believes was an organized operation by the Mossad, his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, took over the presidency. Here, the American-Israeli relationship entered an entirely new phase. Johnson was a very loyal Zionist and opened the tap for Israel to the fullest. One of his most significant services, for instance, was shifting American support from mere political and economic backing and defensive weaponry to military support with offensive weapons. In 1964 and 1965, the Johnson administration struck a secret deal under which it sold Israel 210 M48 Patton tanks. And in February 1966, Washington officially announced the sale of 48A for Skyhawk attack aircraft. Of course, these two deals completely altered the balance of power in the region and paved the way for the 1967 war, which we all know was not self-defense, as the Western world claimed, but rather a plan that had been engineered for a long time. In May 1963, 4 years before the war, the Shacham Plan or Greece Plan was drafted, which included details of the administrative, military, and judicial structure for managing the affairs of the West Bank and Gaza. This means that the idea of expansion was premeditated and was not merely a defensive reaction. Subsequently, when it was Richard Nixon's turn to enter the White House, he brought with him Henry Kissinger as National Security Advisor and William Rogers as Secretary of State. Rogers saw the catastrophe unfolding before him, and in December 1969, he presented an initiative known as the Rogers Plan, which called for Israel's near-total withdrawal from the occupied territories in exchange for lasting peace. However, Kissinger, the loyal Zionist, viewed the Rogers Plan as a clear concession to Soviet-backed Arab states and believed it encouraged Arab extremists. At the same time, AIPAC launched a fierce campaign against the plan and organized conferences to denounce it, which resulted in the peace plan being shelved in late 19. Instead of punishing Israel for rejecting diplomatic initiatives, Nixon submitted a request approved by Congress to provide military appropriations package to Israel worth $500 million for the purchase of offensive weapons. This happened despite the fact that in May 1971, Nixon sent a secret memo to his Secretary of State, William Rogers, later documented by the U.S. State Department as number 233 in the Fruss records, in which he stated verbatim, "Due to the enormous influence of the Jewish lobby in America and its massive impact on the media, we are compromising American national security interests for the sake of Israel." In other words, the man was deeply disgruntled, yet in public, he made decisions to appease the lobby and the occupation government. The greatest credit for this policy went to Henry Kissinger, which illustrates how a single person, backed by the lobby, can steer the policy of a superpower like America, even if it goes against its own interests. After Nixon's resignation, due to the Watergate scandal, which we might dedicate a detailed episode to one day, Gerald Ford assumed the presidency. Ford believed that the blank check policy for Israel was a folly that had to stop. He attempted to pressure them into making concessions during the Sinai disengagement negotiations and threatened a reassessment of U.S.-Israeli relations if they did not comply. This was the first time since the days of Eisenhower that an American president's voice had risen so boldly against the Zionists. However, the Zionist lobby responded with ultimate force. They mobilized 76 out of 99 U.S. senators and had them sign a letter addressed to the president stating that the United States stands firmly with Israel, and any reassessment of relations must be on this basis, meaning any adjustment must be in Israel's favor, not against it. Any senator who dared to object at the time faced a fierce media campaign that led to their electoral defeat. At that moment, Ford realized that, despite being the President of America, he was not the actual ruler. The real ruler was the lobby, when we gather all the threads of the story. From the conflict in Truman's office in '48 to what is happening today, we find a consistent and recurring pattern: American national security. Interests are systematically sacrificed for the sake of the occupation government. The same mechanisms used by the American Zionist Emergency Council in the 1940s are those used by AIPAC today, lobbying campaigns in Congress, linking financial support to political stances, and demonizing any American politician who dares to criticize Israel. The tactics do not change, and the result is the continuation of a blind American policy bias toward Israel, regardless of the damage inflicted upon America and its interests in the region due to this toxic relationship.